gunboats. The Icelandic gunboat Thor races to cut the fishing gear of a British vessel while a frigate of the Royal Navy weaves to head her off. This is the dangerous reality of the latest fishing dispute between the two island races, the Third Cod War, a bitter deadlock over fishing rights that's raged from Westminster to Reykjavik, from the World Court of The Hague to the United Nations. But most of all, it rages here, in conditions that are already dangerous enough. A defiant Thor on collision course with one of two unarmed British support vessels which have been sent with 3 frigates to try to stop the Icelanders from harassing British fishing boats. Thor's captain cuts it fine this time, but his daredevil attempts to stop the trawlermen operating within his country's unilateral 200-mile limit have not always been so successful. Back in Iceland, the Thor licks its wounds, the first casualty of the latest Cod War. The damage to its helicopter deck was caused during a skirmish with British support vessels, sheltering inside Iceland's territorial waters. They ended up ramming the Thor, which replied with a salvo from its 57mm gun. For Iceland, the ramming incident was excellent propaganda material, bolstering their underdog image, and it made Captain Helgi Halvardsson something of a hero.
But you have, in fact, Captain, been the first person to fire a shot in this present Cod War. Isn't this really going to lead to a very dangerous escalation of possible violence on the fishing grounds now?
Well, I just want to make that make it clear that this was inside the Icelandic territorial waters. There is no Cold War inside the territorial waters. All ships are supposed to go after orders from the Coast Guard inside territorial waters.
How much ill feeling and distrust is there now, do you think, between the Coast Guard vessels and the British support ships?
Well, there is no bad feeling from me. I'm just doing my duty and they are doing their duty. But how they do it, that's another thing.
And this is what the war's over. Gadhu Smorhua, the Atlantic cod. To the British people, cod's an essential ingredient for the traditional fish and chip supper. But to Icelanders, it's much more. In fact, as Iceland's only export, the cod's vital for the country's survival, and unfortunately, there's only a limited amount. Icelandic experts say the recent hatching of cod has been so poor that fry could well be fished out in 2 years unless there's strict control. Iceland insists that only 235,000 tons should be taken out a year. British experts put the figure a little higher, and it's this difference, together with the 200-mile limit, which has caused the current dispute. Iceland, of course, wants to keep much of the cod for itself, but it has agreed to let West Germany take 60,000 tons a year. That's 20,000 tons less than it took last year. Britain, on the other hand, is used to taking 130,000 tons a year, and balked at Iceland's order to cut that by half. Britain argues that the reduction would ruin many fishing towns on the country's east coast, and actually harm more British people than the whole population of Iceland.
But they have always had the right to fish here before. What's right? For long times ago, we have here a 50-mile limit before 1900. And after 1903, the British make an agreement with Denmark to have a 3 miles here around East Iceland. But now are we independent since 1944. So no heavy take it, that should be 200 miles here around Iceland.
we will mean that is an international law. There is many countries in the world now, they have a 200 miles. We have got it in many years.
But do you think it's really necessary for Iceland to claim this vast area of ocean, 200 miles for itself? Why do you need it?
Because 19% of our export is fish. And if we lost the fish here around the Iceland, we cannot live in the country. So must we go away again.
Well, do you think that Britain should be allowed to have, do you personally think that Britain should be allowed to have any fish here at all?
The British fishermen, they caught more fish in their home water and they do here around Iceland. And if they have 200 miles around England, they can catch all the fish they need there. But it's not necessary to come here to Iceland to take from us the fish.
Like Seyðisfjörður, Reykjavik also has good reason to make heroes of the men who fight her cod war. For Iceland has to import almost everything she needs, and fish is all she has to offer in return. That makes fish valuable to Iceland, but sadly these days it's less valuable on world markets. This fish slump, coupled with 2 devaluations, has robbed the krona of much of its buying power and left Iceland with an inflation rate as high as 54%. Iceland's said to have the 3rd highest standard of living in the world. The average wage check is over £80 a week, but most men have 2 or even 3 jobs, and many wives have at least 1. But prices are high too. A jar of jam costs £1. A family house, £100,000. Buying from estate liquor stalls also expensive. Iceland's one of few places where people pay for a round of drinks by cheque, with a bottle of scotch costing £11. Cars are twice as expensive as in England. The economic crisis has hit sales by 75%. And that makes the cod war not only an economic issue, but a political one, with pressures being brought to bear by both sides. Britain, as a member of the European Economic Community, has ensured that Icelandic fish will continue to be frozen out of the common market by landing taxes, while Iceland has protested about Britain's action at sea to the UN. What both nations do have in common is membership of NATO, and this might prove a significant factor in bringing an end to the dispute. As the dispute continues, neither side seems optimistic of a settlement. The irony is that in not very many months' time, this whole argument is likely to disappear under new international legislation. In March, an international conference on the law of the sea is due to be held in New York, and it's likely that the 200-mile limit will be approved for all maritime nations, Britain as well as Iceland. So, despite the present bitterness, both sides can console themselves with the thought that this, the 3rd cod war, is likely to be the last.